Welcome, good morning. We're ready for another Fit a Museum collection. Oh, we haven't started yet. Okay. Whoopsie. Good morning. Welcome to another Fit a Museum collection conversation. Oh, there we go. My guest, I'm looking for her right now. So just give me 1 second. Here we go. We're ready. Welcome. I'm Leigh Wishner. I'm the Fit a Museum Registrar and Digital Media Manager. Good morning, Vicki.
Hi, how's it going?
Very well. How are you?
Good.
Fantastic. Well, I just wanted you to know I got dressed for the occasion. I don't know if you can see. I'm doused in hieroglyphics.
I love it.
My Nefertiti suite from Renoir, mid-century references to Egyptomania. And that's part of what we're going to discuss today. Actually, it's going to be a big part of what we're going to discuss today. And I see that we've got people joining, so I would like to introduce you before we start delving into what is admittedly a way too big a subject for an hour conversation. So perhaps we'll have to have part 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know, we'll see. So let me introduce our guest today. Victoria Rose Pass is an associate professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and she's a specialist in visual culture, particularly in the areas of design and fashion. Her research considers the history of fashion culture in the 20th century and focuses specifically on issues of gender and race. Her essay, which is phenomenal, Racial Masquerades in the Magazines, Defining White Femininity Between the Wars, was recently published in the Journal of Modern Periodical Studies. And she has co-edited 2 books, Design Beyond the Canon with Jennifer Kaufman Buehler and Christopher Wilson, published by Bloomsbury in February 2019, and Women's Magazines in Print and New Media with Nolue Rooks and Ayana Weekly, published by Routledge in 2016. Her writing has also appeared in numerous design and fashion-related periodicals. She received her BA in Art History from Boston University, her MA in Art History from the Art Institute of Chicago, and her PhD in Visual and Culture Studies from the University of Rochester. So let's get started. Tell us a little bit about your interest in the subject matter and how you've come to look at issues of race, cultural appropriation in your work.
Yeah, when I was working on my dissertation, I was sort of like the only person that was working on fashion in my program. So I was a bit of a misfit in some good creative ways, I think. And I was looking at Dada and Surrealism in fashion in the 20s and 30s. And there's a significant component, particularly of Surrealism, that is around this idea of Primitivism, which is such a huge part of modernist art, which really quite literally mines cultures from Africa, Oceania, Native North America, in order to create art, and positions those cultures in really particular ways that are very much embedded with racist and colonial hierarchies that support European colonization. And I was really interested to find, when I was looking at fashion from that period, that you could see the same kinds of things in fashion, but in ways that I didn't expect. So I think the thing that really probably most sparked my interest and has sort of led me down this path is a collection of hats that the designer Lily Daché showed in 1937, which were based on a collection of hats she had bought, I think, from Charles Raton, who was a gallerist in Paris, who was very involved with the Surrealists, but also was a dealer in African art. And so this was a collection of hats from the Belgian Congo. And Daché designed a collection of hats. She was a French designer, but had been an immigrant to the US as a young woman and started her business there. And this was a collection of hats primarily intended for white women to wear. And, you know, I saw these images and I was like, wait a minute, the 1930s are profoundly racist in the United States. What are white women like doing? Like, why would a fashion designer say, like, you know what white women are going to want? They're going to want these hats that look like African hats belonging to men. And so that sort of started me off on this topic in a really sustained way. And I, just keep finding more and more. And Egyptomania is such an interesting kind of narrative that weaves its way through, because it's looking at a culture from Africa, but an ancient culture from Africa.
Right.
And it has some interesting resonances within the Harlem Renaissance as well, which I find really compelling. There were a lot of artists in the Harlem Renaissance, a graphic designer, an illustrator, and painter, Charles Dawson, the graphic designer and painter, Aaron Douglas, are two that I could think of, who used Egyptomania. Candace Wheeler, another graphic designer.
And Lois Mayu Jones as well.
Yes, of course.
Amazing.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And so it's just a sort of fascinating thing to see how this ancient culture, which clearly sparks so many of our imaginations, is used in so many different contexts and has so many different kinds of meanings in those various contexts.
Absolutely. And this love of ancient Egypt, predates the 20th century by far. In fact, I'm just gonna grab one of my big Bibles of yore, because I started off my career, I wouldn't say that, but I started off my studies on the undergraduate level as an ancient Near Eastern and Egyptian specialist. I was on the track to become the next Egyptologist, and then I learned about fashion history, and it sort of took a turn. So I've always been very fascinated with ancient Egyptian culture and studied it and it went into graduate school as well. By the time I switched tracks, it was already a little too far gone for me to consider Egyptology anymore. But so I have a deep appreciation for this as well. And something that we touched on in a conversation we had prior to this is and it's something we're going to see in the course of our conversation today. We're going to end with some real fun stuff. Egypt as a source material, you could say it is cultural appropriation. Obviously, it is not Western culture, and it unfortunately has partially become part of our culture through colonial looting. Let's just say that. Yeah. There are several European institutions that probably couldn't exist as well as they do now without the material that they took on colonial campaigns. The Napoleonic campaign in Egypt from 1798 to 1801, that was also a height of Egyptomania in design as well. And so, there's all these discoveries that come into our Western culture through Western activities, and they're mining an ancient culture. Now, part of me says, well, this isn't a living culture anymore. It's not that there aren't pharaohs. There isn't a pharaonic Egypt anymore. It is an ancient fossilized culture, shall we say. So I think that this is why it still remains accessible and a resource that isn't necessarily going to be criticized in modern fashion of today, because it's not, there isn't, I don't know. We might hear from people who are Egyptian. I would love to hear from you about how you feel when you see your ancient past being, paraded down the runway, for example. I know we're going to get to that, but I think that is why Egyptomania is sort of an acceptable or largely accepted form of an appropriation of an ancient culture. It's also just, if you look at it on just one level, it's just beautiful to beautiful art, and it can be very inspiring. And we're about to delve into all the ways it was inspiring. I'm going to focus our attention today on the 20th century, primarily because a lot of exciting things happened, and it's where your primary interests lie and mine. So is there anything you know from our collection that you want to jump into first? I'm happy to go. Ready to go.
I think that the beautiful touring coat from the Outdoor Girls exhibition would be a great place to start.
Why not? So here we are. This is our touring coat that was made in Egypt, most likely for a tourist. I mean, these were pieces, and I know you've done some more research on these, so do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I found out that the embroidery technique on it, which is absolutely beautiful and actually like is quite textural. And if any of y'all haven't yet looked at the beautiful catalog for the sporting fashion show, definitely take a look at it. But this embroidery technique is one that was used on tents in Egypt, and I think if I remember correctly, among Bedouins, but I could be misremembering that. But what I think is really interesting is that it was taking, you know, techniques of embroidery and embellishment that already existed there and producing these styles for a, you know, Western tourist market, you know, people who were coming to Egypt, particularly women who were coming to Egypt, and like this piece of fashion would be a souvenir that they might take home, which would remind them of all of the amazing sights that they had seen in Egypt. And I think with any kind of tourist market, we have like a very complicated relationship between the tourists, the people who live in the place that they're going to. It obviously, you know, this is the 20s. So there's a, you know, ongoing colonial relationship that is, you know, has to be sort of picked apart really carefully. But it's interesting, I think, to see garments that are actually produced in Egypt using these motifs and sort of anticipating, like, what does that Western consumer want? What do they want to take home? And like, what are the images that whoever that designer and maker was imagined that consumer would want to take home with them?
Right, and that is still a tradition that continues today. I was in Egypt in 1997, and I remember we visited the tent maker street. There's like a very famous tent maker street in Cairo, and it's an example of sort of a traditional textile technique. A lot of it is reverse applique, some of it is applique, and it's a great example of sort of pivoting from a traditional craft that's used in a very specific context for these tents. That how do you adapt it to make it saleable? If, for example, if the need for tents doesn't really exist that much anymore, how do you cope and how do you survive? And it was a great coping technique. I just wanted to show you. I have an example of a piece that I brought home.
Oh, beautiful!
Just so that everybody can see. I mean, there are quite a lot of examples of sort of Islamic ornament that are used in these tent hangings, and this was just a small panel. I also have a large panel. And it's just like a candy land for people who love pattern and textiles like I do. So I came home with a few pieces that are treasured, and I was one of these people. I was. Mm-hmm. I mean, I admit that. I went there partially because it was what I was studying, but also because I bought into the exoticism and the excitement and the allure of something that was unusual and mysterious to me. So that will bring us also to some of the ways that, for example, textiles get used in fashions. Here's a piece from the 1920s. I can probably date this to about, let's say, 1922, 23, 24. And there's a very good reason for that. That was when Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings, and it had been a rare tomb that was undisturbed, which blew minds. Really, it did. It opened up a whole decorative vocabulary that prior to that, there was obviously very much written about hieroglyphics and Egyptian art. There were other discoveries, but this one was just over the top, let's say. And so it really, the ripple effect of the fashions, I'm sure that car coat, I mean, the touring coat, I'm sure kind of fit in at right around that time as well. There's just an abundance of ornamentation that's inspired by ancient Egypt. And one thing that I definitely have come across in my research, and perhaps you too, is that it's not important for this to be legible in any way, because nobody without an Egyptology degree understands what it means. So it can be a creative endeavor. You can create a cartouche that has little dots in it instead of anything that speaks of somebody's name. But you can pluck ornament just exactly how it appears in decorative arts from that period. So it's really a fascinating thing, and to say that, you know, it doesn't really matter what these things mean. What the meaning we take away from it is that it's mysterious. It's I mean, I don't want to use the word exotic over and over again, because it's not the right word for it. It's just, there's something mystical, religious, semi quasi religious about it, and I think that's appealing. Let's see. We have and this is another dress from the period. It's French, actually, and I do believe you know a little bit more about this one.
Yeah, this is one I often show to students. And what I think is really interesting about this one is that it's very abstract ornamentation, right? It's not covered in hieroglyphics. It's not covered in like ankhs or images of Egyptian gods and goddesses. So it's a more sort of abstract use of patterning that refers, like it clearly visually is making reference to ancient Egyptian motifs. And I think this one's a great example too, because you'll remind me, but I don't think this isn't like a designer. This is like this isn't from like a high-end couture house, right? This was a more kind of middle of the road.
I'm glad I looked it up yesterday, because it is actually was made by Adair.
Oh, okay.
In Paris. So it's in about 1925. So it's in that sweet spot of the heady excitement of an archaeological discovery. So yes, it was actually made in Paris, and it is.
But there are more middle of the road kind of versions of this.
Absolutely. No, it proliferated, and this is a great piece. I do want to point out, and I'm so glad you use it in your classes, because this is a piece from our own study collection. So this is a piece that we can take into classrooms and let the students handle it and learn a little bit of history, a little bit of construction technique. It's a very versatile piece from the collection to show. So I really appreciate that you use it in your classes with your students.
Yeah, and I often pair it. I should have brought it, but you can Google it, I'm sure. There's a great photograph of Agatha Christie, who is a favorite author of mine, but also definitely a purveyor of Egyptomania. Oh. Her second husband was an archaeologist, and she got very deeply embroiled in his doings, and wrote several of her books are set at archaeological sites. And there's a great photograph of her. She's on a boat going somewhere, and she's wearing this white dress that has like a print, an Egyptomania print on it of like pharaohs being drawn in chariots or something like that.
Oh, wonderful.
And it's like it's just such a great picture to me, because it sort of encapsulates like the ways that she was a purveyor of this herself and also was a consumer of it. And I think yeah, there was this, the fact that we were like, these are, ancient civilizations. This was an ancient civilization that was quite literally being uncovered from under the earth, and new things were being found out about, how ancient Egyptians lived. And I think particularly because the access that archaeologists had to ancient Egypt was in these very elaborate tombs, and this particular way in which the ancient Egyptians buried particularly their leaders, but that burial and the funerary practice was deeply important, but also like that was the thing we had access to. We didn't really have access to people's everyday lives. Right. And the people we were learning about early on. I mean, I think archaeologists now are much more interested in like regular people's everyday lives, but then it was like the pharaohs and the people who had all the gold and the material wealth. And so it's just these like lavish objects. The materials themselves are just so beautiful and luxurious. And I think that's something that could capture people's imaginations. It's also interesting. I was doing some work. I can't even remember why I was looking this up. I think I was just sort of curious about like press coverage, and I was looking up around Nefertiti. And when Nefertiti's, the famous bust of her that we all kind of know in our collective cultural imagining, I think it was uncovered in like the 19 teens at some point, so a bit earlier. than Tutankhamun's tomb. And just as soon it's uncovered by Germans and it's taken to Germany, and as soon as that happens, Egypt is like, no, she should be here. She's ours. Bring her back. She's still in Germany.
Yeah,
but I think yeah, and I think it's very telling to me that there was an awareness about that cultural ownership of that ancient history from the beginning of this archaeology. Egyptians were saying, no, this is our cultural patrimony. That's why I think the tourist objects are really interesting, because that's Egyptians saying, like, this is our cultural currency and here's how we use it to, support our economy and to support our native crafts and, different kinds of textile traditions and things like that.
Right. Here's what you can legally take home, for example.
Yeah. We'll make you this beautiful coat. You can have that, but, leave the things that you've unburied with us and we'll put them in our museums.
And it is part of how these cultural ideas keep circulating is, that's the purpose of a souvenir. You bring it home, it reminds you, obviously, but it also allows the people around you that haven't had your experience of travel to learn a little bit more. So in a way, it's like being a cultural ambassador through your souvenirs. I mean, I know people often just write them off as tchotchkes and, they're just mass market, commercial, non-authentic things, but I'm a big believer in the study of souvenirs as a much more important thing than most people give them credit for. So I have, let's see, we have lots of directions I can go in. I also pulled for today, because we were going to talk a little bit more about Orientalism in general, and also a little bit more, we're going to keep it more into the Middle East, because frankly, Orientalism is a huge topic. We couldn't possibly do Southeast Asia, India, China, Japan, Russia, everything on the Asian continent. We can't do it in one day. So I've kind of stuck towards the Levant and Mediterranean, and I know that you have a fondness for this poire in our collection. And I don't know, I know that you quoted a scholar regularly in your article that I mentioned at the top, her comments on Poiret's use of Orientalism, and I would love to hear you speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the scholar is Minha Tifam, who writes brilliant things on fashion, and she's wrote an article that's several years old now. I can't remember exactly the date. I should have pulled it and printed it out, but you'll easily find it online, I think. And you can email me if you can't find it and you want a PDF. I'm happy to share the wealth. But what she argues in that article in looking at Poiret and Poiret's engagement with Orientalism is that his clothing, she reads it as a technology, which I think is really compelling. And she thinks about how it's a kind of technology that allows for women in France, when this collection comes out as a part of this, he throws these spectacular parties. And so he throws a party called the 1001 Night Party, which is obviously a reference to Scheherazade, and is full of Orientalism. And it's this fantasy about this, imagined geography, as Edward Said calls it, of the Orient. And what Pham says is that the construction that Poiret creates around this collection through this party and through the images that he produces of this collection is one in which women who are wearing harem trousers as part of this collection. This is a lampshade tunic, which is this was a more sort of like everyday part of the collection. The harem trousers were really costumes for the party that were meant to sort of be like a, just like something that would draw attention, what we would call clickbait now, right? Women wearing harem trousers, what? And it's 1914. Am I remembering? No, it's earlier than that.
1913.
1913.
Not
okay.
far off, yes.
Just really before World War I breaks out too. And so Pham argues that what Poiret is really doing is to create this construction in which women are not really taking on trousers, this masculine privilege, at the expense of white men, and these are white women notably, but these white women are taking on trousers at the expense of the Oriental man in this construction. So it's men in the Orient who are being castrated through this exchange. So, you know, Poiret dressing up as a man from the Orient. Again, it's imagined place. This is all a white Western construction. And I find it an incredibly compelling argument. And she looks, for instance, at how Linnaeus, who's the one who's responsible for all of the kind of, hierarchies and divisions within botany and biology and so forth, also does the same thing for race, as you would expect of a scientist of his age. And so it's this pseudoscience, this racialized and racist science. And part of it is clothing. And so Linnaeus says that I think he calls them Asiatic cultures wear loose clothing. Where Western cultures wear tailored clothing. And that was something I found really compelling when I was looking at, for instance, at designers in the 30s appropriating saris, which are, draped clothing, very intricately draped clothing, quite different from, Western tailoring. But of course, when white Western designers appropriated them, they often sewed them. Because there wasn't the cultural knowledge in Europe or in America among white women to properly drape a sari. So they're just simulating that. But that was a racialized signifier within those pseudoscientific racist hierarchies. So
representing some loose morals if your clothes are loose and
easy
to comfortable and eat. I mean, pajamas is a perfect example.
Yeah. And I think we see this in a lot of clothing intended for relaxation. We often see in European and American design, we see designers appropriating from other cultures there, where you can have this like exotic reference in a more casual garment. And it feeds into this idea that like those cultures don't work. They're different from us. They're lazy, right? It feeds into these racist ideas in it's almost like white noise, appropriately called white noise. It's like this dim background noise that helps to just keep those hierarchies fed enough so that they're not undermined, and that, you can maintain that these ideologies of white supremacy and colonization.
Right. I mean, all you have to do is say caftan nowadays. Here's a wonderful example from our collection. That's an Oscar de la Renta piece from 1982. And it is an exceptional caftan over a pair of like a pajama pant. So it's absolutely this look that is of ease, with a bit of bling, some embroidery around the neckline, some motifs that are plucked from Persian carpets. So this is more of in the Persian vein. And it's just exactly what you think of, I guess today you would call this, boho or something like that. And it's this loose comfort, almost a little bit of jet setting, so that you're exotic. You've been around the globe. You've been around enough to know what parts of other cultures work for you, is also, I think, part of that colonial.
Yeah, it's a status symbol.
Yeah, exactly. That colonial aspect of, oh, I'll take that. I mean, I'm not going to take the rest of your culture, but I'll take this because I can improve it by, putting a zipper on the back or whatever.
Or wearing it in my cultural conscience.
Right. Or cutting it and making princess seams. Why would you do that? Because there are so many cultures around the globe that cutting cloth is like a concept that really doesn't exist, because cloth is precious.
It's wasteful.
Very wasteful. It takes a long time to weave. It can be very expensive depending on the materials. So why on earth would you cut it up and then put it back together? So that is also something that, and you do see that as a concept coming in mid-century design a lot. One of my favorite iconoclasts, Bernard Radovsky, with his Our Clothes Modern exhibition, there was so much that he wrote about, like the Barbary of us, of our Western culture, and what we do to fabric, and how atrocious it is that we tailor things. Like, there are T-shaped garments for a reason. They're comfortable, they're practical, they don't waste. It's kind of amazing. So I have a couple other little, I have another Persian example and another Turkish inspired example. This is a tiny clutch purse that I posted on our social accounts the other day, and it was made in Paris around 1930, and it features a design of a hunting scenes, and it's almost verbatim lifted from Safavid Iranian textiles from the 16th century. And I love it because I am a textile historian, so when I saw this, I was like, oh my gosh, I know what this is all about. I know what inspired it. And for me, these types of objects are also a little bit like we touched on. They're a little bit of a way to show that you're claiming another culture, but you're also with this. I mean, these are sophisticated fabrics. I mean, there are some fabrics that are woven in this part of the world that people still are trying to understand all the intricacies about. And it's just, to me, it's because it's sometimes when it's a sophisticated culture, it's more something that will mesh with your own perceived sophistication. If you're a European, these are the highest of quality things. They're made for royalty. So why wouldn't you also want to participate in that cultural lineage? Really, sort of. It's an interesting way of culturally appropriating. You're almost paying the highest compliment by just stealing it. I also
and kind of claiming that like that luxury for yourself from another place.
Absolutely.
In a sense.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And then here's a wonderful pair of Ferragamo slippers, and note that toe. The heels are phenomenal. They don't necessarily have the same orientalizing feel to me as basically that toe, which we would call a Turkish toe. If you were looking at, for example, an 18th century shoe, because there was a fad in the 18th century for turquoiserie, and a lot of shoes had these tiny little turned up toes. So this is just another example of luxury, sort of something that's modeled on an actual prototype of a footwear that's not Western. And yes, it's the height of Western luxury. They're from about 1940 to 45. So I just wanted to show you guys those. They're so beautiful. Love them. The highlight of our shoe collection for sure. And why don't we jump back into our Egyptomania tour, because I have so many things laid out in front of me and I want to make sure we get to as many as possible. We've definitely covered some of my favorite pieces. This is something that I know you've posted about recently in the last few days. This is an Astute shawl from our collection. And why don't you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, this was like I didn't travel very much this summer because of the panoramic, but I did get to a couple of museums, and I feel like this was the thing that was following me in my few little travels. I saw a beautiful, I think it was a dress, if I'm not mistaken, at the RISD Museum in their fashion collection when I was in Providence this summer, that was made out of this textile. And the label said it was, the textile was made in Egypt and the dress was made, I think, in Paris, but it was somewhere in Europe. I might be misremembering. I know I posted it on my Instagram at some point. And I was so interested in this textile that was made for the tourist market in Egypt, and clearly has, you know, relationship to Egyptomania. The gold in particular, I think, with King Tut's tomb, like anything gold and Egyptian looking became popular. And you can see the technique is to take a net fabric, like almost like a wider hold tool that was machine produced. And then you wove through these very thin strips of metal that would then be hammered to create these sort of flat decorations, this flat patterning on through the net. And so you can see it almost has like a pixelated look to it, right? Because it's all these little squares. And it fits so beautifully into the aesthetics of the Art Deco movement. Like anything shiny is very appropriate for Art Deco. And Deco, of course, has this huge element of Egyptomania, as well as a huge element of primitivism and mining Africa more broadly. But I think the motifs would have fit right into somebody who was already excited about, like, you know, modern kind of styles in their wardrobe. And it was just interesting to me. The thing that I still want to understand better about this textile is, like, you know, when I've looked at that garment, and the other one I saw was at the Frick in Pittsburgh. It wasn't in the Outdoor Girls Show, which was fabulous, but it was in their car exhibition. Mm-hmm. And it was a coat made out of this Astute textile. Oh. And it was so interesting because both of the garments, like, they had different kinds of patterning in different sections, and it looked like it was tailored to the garment. So my next question was, okay, so, like, how were these patterns being woven? Like, were the dressmakers who got this textile later just adapting and figuring out how to work with whatever the person had bought in Egypt? Or were the, you know, weavers of these fabrics, like, weaving to specifications, like, oh, this is a fabric you can have made up into a coat, this is one that lends itself to, like, a simple 20s, you know, drop waist dress. So it's just, I'm always fascinated with these, like, you know, kind of things that are made particularly for export, anticipating what a Western audience wants. Absolutely. And again, it was something that was a technique that, you know, was born out of fishnets and things that were being produced there, you know, early on without machines, and then later on with machines. And so it's like things that were already, it's named for the place, Astute, which is where these are made. And some of the speculation I saw said they probably went back to the Napoleonic era, the era of Napoleon coming into Egypt. Okay. So it's not clear how old they are.
That's very interesting.
Interesting.
I also see a relationship with Indian thumbnail embroidery. They call it thumbnail embroidery because it's basically the same technique. It's a little bit more free form rather than geometric always, but it's basically the pressing of with your thumbnail, that's why they call it that, of the thin metal strip into, in India it would be a sheer mull. But yeah, I see that relationship as well. And I also see an ancient relationship, which is the beaded dresses, the net dresses that are part of early dynastic culture. And I remember, I think it was a couple of years ago that Prada did a beaded net dress when they did some Egyptomania references in one of their collections as well. So yeah, so this is, I did want to say this is Art Deco period. And I would be very interested to know if this fits into that tradition of a Western merchant traveling to Egypt and saying, you know, my clients want to make these things into dresses. Could you please, you know, concentrate your embroidery in this shape, because it's going to get cut up to make this. And then I would imagine there's some connection with an enterprising Westerner saying, this is what my people want. Can you give it to me? And they, you know, they're able to do everything. So we have this one, and we also have one in cream. So they were frequently, this is like a very, very dark brown. It's a little hard to appreciate, but we also have one in cream. And so you see them usually in those two palettes. I can't recall ever seeing one in a color. Yeah.
And I'm impressed with how, like, shiny they still are. I mean, they're 100 years old, so I don't know if there's anything particular about the method that prevents them from tarnishing. But
it must be the alloy that they use.
Yeah, it must be something about that, because they're not silver, which, like, silver lame would tarnish before you had learned.
No, so there must be some chemical makeup to the alloy that prevents oxidation. But again, There's these are some research projects for some students, perhaps, to take up.
Tell us what you find out.
Right, tell us what you find out. So I also have a few pieces of jewelry that are highlights from our collection. Really fantastic belt, a Galileth belt. So Galileth is an early plastic, and it's to me, it is based on the girdles that were worn in ancient Egypt. They're not like girdles, the word girdle that we associate with a feminine undergarment. They were really low slung waist bracelets for your waist. How about we call it that? Not even I mean, it is a belt, but it's what you would.
But it's not to hold anything up.
Right, it doesn't hold anything up. And in fact, it was really sort of to show off the fertile area, shall we say. Mm-hmm. But, you know, there's just these little tiny hints of how you can incorporate a touch of the ancient, a touch of the exotic, a touch of like being associated with gods and goddesses. That's a good look, right?
And here's another, like, maybe this is a crackpot theory, but I don't think it's totally crackpot. Like this ornament, like there's a radio I can think of in my head, which I think is even almost the shade of green, that is also from this period, like early Bakelite, I think, though also a plastic. And it has a little ornament that is an Egyptomania ornament. And they often have the sort of stepped designs. They're looking at the Aztecs. They're, you know, they're mining lots of cultures and often these European and American designers and just shoving them all together into one thing. But I think when you're dealing with a material like plastic, which is new and exciting, I think there's also, I think one of the other reasons that Egypt is fascinating to people and remains fascinating is it almost looks futuristic too, right? And so I think that's why we see Afrofuturists using ancient Egyptian motifs all the time. And I think that might also be like part of what was exciting to people in the 20s, this moment when, you know, part of what Art Deco was doing was like really looking self-consciously modern. And then like looking back at ancient Egypt, being like, man, this aesthetic that this ancient culture had looks so modern to us. It looks so fresh and new. So what better thing to marry with new technology like radios, new materials, or even like think about all the movie theaters that were decked out in Egyptomania glory, you know, like if you've not seen them, picture the Cheesecake Factory now, but better. I mean, cheesecake, like we could have a whole conversation about like, why is the Cheesecake Factory Egyptomania? I don't know.
Yeah, and we have our very own Grauman's Egyptian theater here in Los Angeles. Right. That is spectacular. So yes, almost every city in this period wound up with a tiny little Egyptian theater. It's quite amusing. But yes, so you know, sometimes you can't wear your full goddess attire, so maybe it's just a little tiny brooch. Here's an amazing 1920s pin, a French metal pin. So it was not a tourist object from Egypt, but what's at center is an actual carapace from a beetle. So you do have a very totally non-Western traditional jewelry material. Now, beetles and beetle wings have been used in India and elsewhere as almost like sequins, actually as sequins, for hundreds of years. And there is that beauty of the iridescence and the textures. But this one is really fascinating because it does have this really bumpy texture to it. And it, yes, again, a good conversation piece, a good conversation starter, but it's a small way to introduce a little bit of something non-Western into your garments. One last piece of jewelry that's pretty great is, and it also brings in an element we haven't discussed today. This is also a check necklace from that period, in the 1920s. It's glass beads, and I'm just going to show you some of the details from it. Again, you get these beautiful, you know, Nile-inspired colors as well. Nile blue and Nile green were popular through the century, actually. You will read a lot about that in fashion magazines, as you know. So we have these, on top we have an Egyptian head pharaonic Egyptian head. But at the bottom, we have something that's a slightly different. And it makes more sense when we see one of the beads that's on the side of the necklace. This is actually modeled on an Assyrian prototype of a human-headed bull god. So you're mixing.
Oh yeah, the Lamassu that you usually see from the side.
Lamassu, exactly.
Yeah.
So you would have seen these in Nineveh, but you would have also seen these at the British Museum, and you would have seen them dispersed all over the Western world by this period as well, because they're paralleling all the archaeological discoveries and excavations in Egypt were a series of also very, very important to the field of archaeology excavations in the I'm sorry, I just lost my moment, in Iran and Iraq. So the ancient Near East and Assyria. So that doesn't quite click as much as the Egyptian.
Yeah, I have seen the discovery of, and I'm going to forget her name. Maybe you'll remember, but there was a queen that was discovered in Iran in the 20s, who's now in the Penn Museum.
Yes, the jewelry is extraordinary.
The jewelry. Yeah, and that jewelry seemed to really like spark people's imaginations. And when you read the stories that were in the newspapers, I mean, you can see how these kinds of Orientalist narratives get sort of like woven in. Like they're always like tragic stories, and there are murders and betrayal, and they didn't know anything basically. Like they're just spinning these yarns because they sort of fit in with existing ideas about the Middle East in that period, among in that case among Americans is where that was predominantly being written about.
Right. So there's all these little ways to incorporate accessories. Here's one more pair of shoes that some people may recognize. These are a little bit more recent in our memory. They're gold strapped shoes with jewels all along them, and then these amazing little metal tipped heels. You know, they are vaguely Egyptian, vaguely Middle Eastern, vaguely, they're not necessarily something you would point to and say, I definitely see the Egyptian reference. But the maker of the shoes is stamped in the bottom of the sole of the shoe is, let's see, I'm looking for it in my notes. Cleopatra by Fern. So, you know, there's certainly this attempt to make them Egyptian, and I'm sure that they're early 60s, and I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that Liz Taylor and Cleopatra had just a little something to do with this. So there are a lot of cases where popular culture is also a catalyst and not necessarily archaeological discoveries. In the mid-century period, 1954, there was a major archaeological discovery. Besides the pyramids, they discovered a solar barge. And so this also reinvigorated reignited the interest in ancient Egypt. And so in popular culture, you'll see a lot of sword and sandal type films that pop up with Egyptian themes, and
like the Ten Commandments, which was probably my introduction as a Jewish kid. Passover, we used to watch that.
Vicky, this is I cite that movie as the reason that I went on that path. I mean,
the costumes are amazing.
They are. They're completely, don't start on us historians. We know they're not accurate.
They're a hot mess.
But the great thing about that film is that they did actually consult with museum curators for the whole shebang. And yeah, of course they need to give people glamorous references from their daily lives. So they all look like they're wearing evening gowns of, you know, chiffon. But a lot of the other details, some of the other details are accurate, like in some of the jewelry and hairstyles are, you know, not bad. But yes, that was also my literal gateway drug into this. So that's what I'm glad to know that two Jewish girls were like, ooh.
Like we were supposed to be excited about Moses. We're like, look at what Ramses is wearing. What is he wearing?
Oh gosh, I know. Well, actually, I do have one fun piece in our collection from 1955, and it is a screen-worn gown by Walter Plunkett and Helen Rose, and it was designed for Esther Williams to wear. It's not a bathing suit, so she did have other costumes in this film, and it is it's Egypto inspired, and there's a publicity still. If you go look for it online, you'll find it, and she's got an Egyptian headdress on, and it's it's set in ancient times, and this is a marvel of construction. It's all wool jersey strips and file and lame strips. It's all strips that are sewn together. Cow. So that kind of reminds me of the sort of mummy technique, which I think is, I'm not sure that that's what the original inspiration was, but yes, it is exquisitely constructed, and it's one of our pieces from our Hollywood collection, and I just love every chance I get to take a look at that. But what it also, for me, reminded me when I was also combing through for all the Egyptian wonders, is this fantastic dress that was given to us by Doris Raymond of The Way We Wore. And it is Zach Posen from 2003. And it is called the Cleopatra's Garden Dress, or it's one of his Cleopatra's Garden dresses. It was the theme of the collection. And it's kind of fantastic because it's cotton, and it's of a sort of a muslin color. It's a dull color with these thin little black strips. And to me, I feel that it's referencing mummy wrappings. I can't say I've ever spoken to Zach Posen to find out if that's his inspiration, but I really that's
what I saw when you sent it to me.
Oh, good.
I thought that's what that looks like.
This is an overactive imagination, but here's a photograph of Naomi Campbell wearing it on the runway, and every mummy should look so good, is all I can say.
Well, and some of the mummies do have like very complex like weaving through the wrapping. It's not just like the mummy of the horror movies that we know, right? They're quite beautifully woven and wrapped with fine linen, so it makes sense.
They are extremely intricate, and even into the Coptic period, they're when there were still mummification practices, they're just, mind-blowing. And I find this dress to be very compelling for that reason. It's not the Egyptomania of gold and glitz and glam. It's the Egyptomania of what's underneath the gold and glitz and glam, but it's still, it also has extremely Art Deco sensibilities to it.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting example because it's not that kind of exotification of a culture that seems to be happening here, at least to my eye. This seems to be more like sort of being inspired by, technique, by patterning and things like that, and just taking it in a kind of different direction, right? Like she's not wearing a big pharaoh brooch or something on it, it's a more sort of subtle way of looking to a culture, thinking about it, understanding it, and then thinking about how you might use that in your own work.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I like that kind of synergy between those. And I just wanted to show you one last piece of Egyptomania or actually a couple pieces of Egyptomania that are from the 70s, because in the 70s we have another big occasion, and it's not actually a discovery. It's a tour. The King
that's great.
Treasures of Treasures of Tutankhamun. It traveled to 6 American cities from November of 1976 to April of 1979. And so in that period, boy, do you get to see a lot of fun Egypto revival pieces, but they have their own 70s flair. So here's a fantastic shirt we have in the collection, a man's shirt.
Classic.
And it's just so cool. Here's the detail so you can really see what the pattern is.
Come on, disco dancing in that shirt.
I know. It's like there's nothing subtle about what this is all about. your disco tut. You've got, maybe we should send it to Steve Martin so he can revive his King Tut routine.
Yeah, also inspired, right, by that submission.
Absolutely. And a really fantastic piece that is almost a literal recreation. It's a necklace from that period, and it's reproducing a Horus pectoral. So this is not necessarily a reinterpretation. It's a reproduction, shall we say? And it's almost like a exit through gift shop type of piece, but it wasn't made by a museum gift shop. So those are just a couple of the fun 70s pieces we have in the collection. And let's see. Oh boy, I think we're getting close to our denouement here, which is going to be sort of showing some pieces from the modern age in recent history. And I know you have written a few things recently about them as well and showcased them. And it was actually one of the reasons I was like, I think I should have a conversation with you about this because you seem to be a kindred soul. But we have some modern interpretations of the ancient look. So these are very, very recent. This is Tracee Ellis Ross at the Vanity Fair party in 2020, Oscar's Vanity Fair party. And she's wearing a Lebanese fashion designer, Zuhair Mourad. And I know you did a little bit more research about his work. Do you want to share with us about that?
He did a whole kind of Egyptian inspired collection that was, this dress was from, and there were a lot of celebrities who wore pieces from it on the red carpet. And I think we would have seen it more if, the pandemic, this was right before, the pandemic hit. This was the Oscars that happened right before. So I think it was like a collection interrupted in a sense, and then fashion shut down for a minute.
Right.
But, the thing that I found interesting about Ross, and the reason I found this is because I remembered seeing her. I mean, she's such a fashion icon. I remember seeing her in this fabulous bubblegum pink suit or shocking pink suit that had Egyptian motifs on it. And I was trying to find that. And then I stumbled upon this and I was like, whoa, what collection is this from? And I think it's very interesting to see a Lebanese designer who had his studio in Beirut up until that awful explosion that happened there, which destroyed it. But he shows in Paris. And so I think it's interesting to have a Lebanese designer working with these kinds of motifs. And then African-American celebrities using them, in the ways that I think we might have seen Harlem Renaissance artists use them. Almost, to me, Ross, it's the kind of Afrofuturist aesthetic that she seems to be evoking. And it reminded me of Billy Porter at the Met Ball. That's what I mean.
I was like, we're not going to get out of this conversation without this epic moment on the red carpet. He was carried in on a litter like royalty. And this is absolutely one of my most favorite. And this was for the camp exhibition.
Yes.
So that makes a lot of sense. I love this. This is a sort of a take on a quote that he said about this, that the Egyptian realness actually isn't too heavy to wear. So I just thought that was.
And I loved this. I loved this. I wrote a little bit about this last year, and actually his stylist, whose name is all the names are escaping my brain now.
Do I have it? No, I don't have it. I had the design duo was the blondes. I don't.
Yeah, the blondes created it, and his stylist really kindly talked to me on the phone. I just DM'd him on Instagram just on a whim and thought, I wonder if he would talk. And it was really interesting to talk to him because he grew up in a very religious, a Christian family. And he said he was always sort of drawn to the ancient Egyptians when he was reading the Bible. And I thought that was interesting. And that was something he had in common, I think, with Billy Porter, who'd also been raised in a very religious family. And so I thought that was interesting. And I wonder how kind of common a thread it is for people that, many of us who grow up either, I think in most probably, Judaism and Christianity, perhaps even people, you know, who run into the Bible in one way or another, in the way that it kind of can dominate in a this country that, you know, is kind of dominated by, you know, Christianity in certain ways, like that. There's that like little piece of it that maybe just sparks people's imagination. And I also love that, you know, both sort of drawing on the camp possibilities of ancient Egypt and all of the stars who have drawn on that. He cited Diana Ross in Mahogany. He cited Liz Taylor and Cleopatra, of course. But also drawing attention to the Egyptian artifacts in the Met, you know, that, you know, African history that's in the Met that often we forget is part of Africa. And also, you know, I think questions about ownership. Who owns the Temple of Dendor? You know, like, is that where the Temple of Dendor should be? I mean, to be fair, it had to be removed because the place it was in was going to be flooded.
Absolutely.
So it had to go somewhere.
Yes, it did. It did, and that's a whole nother.
That's a whole other story. That's a whole other story.
You know,
I went down that rabbit hole when I was researching Billy Porter. So it's really, I mean, it's like a geopolitical rabbit hole, like, you know, deep geopolitical rabbit hole.
Yeah. Oh, we have somebody who commented that Farrell was great in Chanel style too, and I do remember that Chanel collection a couple years ago. That was at
the Temple of Dendor.
That was actually presented at the Temple of Dendor. So, you know, it's interesting when you start seeing artifacts as backdrops for modern commerce. It's also, that's another thread of 20th century fashion editorials, using art, and I have seen photos also of a model, and I want to say it was Lisa Fonsegruz, but I can't remember, wearing some of the jewelry excavated at Ur in front of some of the Assyrian. I want to say that this was all at the Met. I'm gonna have to find that photo, and I'll have to try to share it through social media now, because
I want to see that.
So there are times when there were models wearing ancient jewelry to show you how chic they could look today. Of course, they weren't advocating you should find the ancient pieces. I'm sure there was some tie-in for another jewelry designer.
Yeah, because like legitimately buy these pieces from reputable dealers who are selling them and funding, you know, the country that they are from. You know,
exactly.
I think, you know, the mining of cultures. I mean, like, our archaeology can be, when it's practiced in unethical ways, a way of doing that, and is often, you know, tied up with looting, which we still see, unfortunately. We do, unfortunately, and the antiquities market and trade in antiquities is also one of the reasons I decided I didn't want to pursue a career path in ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean work, because I was advised how there was a lot of unethical day-to-day stuff, and I was like, oh, I don't know, maybe I won't do that. So I can only imagine. Yeah. So I know you've posted a couple of very recent creations, and just in the last couple of days, you were posting Anna Sui's recent Egyptomania inspired collection, and I absolutely love those cowboy boots, some Egyptian cowboy boots for me. So good. Phenomenal. But I also kind of wanted to wrap up our conversation with a parallel of a piece in our collection with something that you posted that I would kill to wear, especially if I looked this good in it. But this is the Carrie Washington, also at the same party as Tracy Ellis Ross for the Oscars. Yeah, the same designer, yeah. Same designer, and it is, I mean, phenomenal isn't quite the right word. I'll get you a detailed close-up of the skirt in a second, but you know, it incorporates these elements of collars, floral collars, or faience collars that were worn. It has a lot of ornament that you would see in tomb paintings, for example. So it's mixing ornaments from different parts of, or different media, really. And then this skirt, which I'll show you a bigger detail of, which
and it's all sequined. It's entirely sequined and beaded, and I don't know, it must weigh a lot, but I would gladly suffer to wear this. So this has pictures of representations of gods like Anubis, Osiris. This is probably the King Tut death mask. And we have some scenes probably that were taken from either papyrus scrolls or tomb paintings. So it's again, and then a winged figure here. So it's even like tiny little figures everywhere. I mean, it's exquisite, and I absolutely adore this. You can send it to us for our collection if you want, Mr.
Campaign to
just putting it out there.
Rod's Design House, please.
But I will absolutely settle for this special piece that we just got. So I haven't even accessioned it yet. I'm a little behind, but this is actually a dress that belonged to a flamenco dancer, a professional flamenco dancer, and she had a wardrobe of exquisite stage wear. And we have 2 dresses that were just donated to us recently. And this is, again, it's covered in gold sequins with jewels. Wow. And it just has this sort of lotus form on the top. I mean, the straps are all bejeweled. But then as you travel down, the skirt is solid gold. And then you get to this hem, which has, oh gosh, just bands, rows of sequins of multicolors, mostly in sort of these rich terracotta red and blue, and also more gold. And these are, again, they're very, very reminiscent of some of the things you would see in tomb paintings, sort of parallels to, oh, sorry, I'm trying to get both of these things in at once. It's not going to work. But it has the same feel, let's say. I can't do both pictures at once. But yes, I didn't try that first. But yeah, so you have clear Egyptomania references. This is probably from the 30s. So again, it's tied into Cleopatra, the Claudette Colbert version. Yeah. There's so many films that also influence our imagination of these cultures. So, it's been such a pleasure to look at all of this material. I'm just trying to see if there have been any questions that we need to answer. Just going to scroll through this for 1 second just to make sure that nobody's really asking questions. People are just enjoying it. That's great. I mean, good news. So yes, as you mentioned, we do have our sporting fashion exhibition, which does feature that amazing touring coat. It's about to close at the Frick Pittsburgh. I think you have 1 more week to see it. Closes next Sunday. If you're in that area, please go ahead and
go and see it. It's so worth it. Oh my gosh, it's one of the best fashion exhibitions I've ever seen.
We crowned you the unofficial FIDM chronicler for the sporting fashion exhibition at the Frick. So you must go and find Visual Sustenance on Instagram and scroll through for all the posts she did. Such thoughtful and interesting analysis of some of our curatorial choices, and she's got the goods. So please go and check that out. Are there any other things you wanted to say on the subject? There might be a little bit you want to tell us about your current research.
Sure. I just saw somebody asked in the chat, is Egyptomania coming back? And I think it absolutely is. I think we've seen enough in the last couple of years that I think it's due for a comeback. And yeah, the project I'm working on right now, the research is actually like sort of crosses, which is why I ended up looking at all this Egyptomania stuff recently, is looking at this fad in the 1920s that for what jewelry that were called slave jewelry or slave bracelets, and trying to understand how that fad fit into the racial politics of the 1920s, and how it fit into the larger kind of jazz modern aesthetic and the elements of primitivism that were part of the Art Deco aesthetic that was often tied up with jazz music, and the way that you had this kind of again, this like clash of things that are all sort of brought together by these white designers of, different cultures. Within the aesthetics of jazz, it was often Africa, the Southern plantation, sort of in a mishmash really together. And I'm trying to sort of understand why these pieces of jewelry are called slave jewelry, because there's no reason they have to be called that. They could be called anything. They're very simple. We're talking about bangle bracelets, chain link bracelets, chain link necklaces. So obviously there was, there were people who thought that this added some kind of cachet to them. And I think it is very much embroiled in the kind of racial politics and the racism in the 1920s, because after all, this is really the peak of the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, just as one metric or barometer. So yeah, that's what I'm working on, and I think Egyptomania is often like lingering there in the background.
Absolutely, and I'm sure if our audience goes and looks through magazines from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s onwards, you will often see that accessorizing of these foreign things with the bangles high up on the arm.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't normally wear them, but that's because they're not normally for us. So I encourage everybody who's joined us today to start thumbing through some old magazines and see what you can find. You're literally going to trip over Orientalism every other page, probably. But
Olive had a whole campaign of Egyptomania ads.
Yeah.
So many ads. I found Egyptian toothpaste.
I dreamed I was Cleopatra and my maid of
Yep.
bra.
Yes.
Oh yeah, and cold. I mean, we could go on and on, but we can't.
Yeah, we could.
So I will look forward to the next time that we get to welcome you to this opportunity to share with our audience. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. This was a blast. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. And on behalf of the FIDM Museum, thanks to everybody who's been watching, and thanks to Dr. Victoria Pass. Bye.
Thanks everybody for watching. Bye. Happy weekend.
Happy weekend.